This murderer is definitely the most cunning murderer in South Korea. He specially picks out young girls who live alone. If he is afraid, he will cruelly throw them away like garbage. If he likes him, he will imprison him and use potions to make his body limp and act as his own. A jailbreak toy. The murderer was very cunning and carefully cleaned the scene after each crime. He killed 16 daughters in a row. Until 30 years later, the police still have not found him. The first is the shocking murder scene. An imprisoned old man was about to sleep, but a man in black suddenly appeared, strangled the old man's neck, and strangled him to death. Afterwards, the man in black packed up the messed up items, put the old man on the bed and covered him with a quilt, pretending to be asleep, and then quickly left the scene. A few days later, a child accidentally saw the scene in the house. The child was thrown to the ground at once, because the old man's body was rotting and smelly. They arrived at the scene quickly, but did not find any trace of the murderer, so they thought that the old man died peacefully in his sleep. Nearby residents were not surprised by his death. Police believed he drowned after being drunk and falling into a slippery river. Lao Shen is a long-term resident of this community. He drinks every day, gets drunk, and lives on the streets all his life. Because he had the foresight to build several self-built houses when he was young, he lived a boring life of visiting the house every day to collect rent. Watching his old friends leaving one after another, he also felt sad that there would be no more days. At night, he came to the second floor and prepared to ask Lao Kui. Lao Kui had just collected the rent and bought some good wine and meat. The two of them sat down and had a few drinks. Lao Kui used to be a criminal police officer. He believed that the death of several elderly people in the community was not as simple as it seemed on the surface. They were not accidental or natural deaths. Instead, they were virtually murdered because a similar case happened in this community 30 years ago. At first, the murderer killed a few elderly people living alone, and then extended his claws on young girls. There are more than a dozen missing girls who have not been able to find out until now. After finding the murderer, Old Shen thought that he had thought too much. Everything must be a coincidence. After saying that, he stood up and was about to leave. When he went out, he found that the door could not be closed. It turned out that the door was broken. Old Shen immediately told Officer Kui that he would fix it tomorrow morning. Before I knew it, it was 2 o'clock in the night. The door of Officer Kui's room was suddenly opened. The wind blew into the room and it was very cold. Officer Kui soon woke up from the cold. He got up and prepared to close the door. The next day, Lao Shen came to the second floor and prepared to put Officer Kui's door into the room. It was repaired, but Officer Kui was lying on the ground without responding. Old Shen had no choice but to walk into the room and was knocked to the ground in an instant. Officer Kui was actually hanged. At this time, several social workers arrived and were shocked by the rape. Judging from the situation, Officer Kui should have committed suicide not long ago. Lao Shen had a big quarrel with Officer Kui over the rent. He is usually mean and the tenants don't like him very much. Therefore, everyone thought that he must have gone to the police again last night. The rent drove Officer Kui to a dead end. The innocent Old Shen kept trying to solve the problem, but no one believed that he was scolded by the neighbors for several days. Old Shen was also a little unsure of himself. He began to reflect on whether he had really done something wrong. So he came to Officer Kui's rental house to remember his old friend. He thought a man rushed in and suddenly put Lao Shen to the ground. The man called Lao Shen and was Officer Kui's former colleague. He concluded that Officer Kui was it is impossible to commit suicide because he has not seen his son for 20 years. He just sent him a passport to go abroad and is going to meet him for an interview. How can a father who is about to see his son commit suicide in the evening? Zian returned to the rental house and found his best friend lying on the toilet. When he was unconscious, he thought his best friend had drunk too much again. But when he was about to help him, he found a large amount of blood. It turned out that his best friend had had her throat cut and died. He was so distraught that he quickly took out his mobile phone and prepared to call the police. Unexpectedly, the killer did not leave, rushed out and pounced on him. Lao Shen lived downstairs from Zian and was immediately awakened by the noise. At this time, Zian was completely unconscious. The killer was about to drag him into the room, but there was a soft sound. Old Shen was awakened by the knock on the door and was cursing outside the door. The killer quickly pulled out a sharp knife and was ready to strike at any time. Old Shen Jianxian didn't open the door until he decided to use the key to go in by himself. The tenant next to him happened to see it but immediately stepped forward. After stopping him, he said that all the tenants on the whole floor had come out. Lao Shen had no choice but to leave quickly. He thus saved his own life. The killer immediately put away the knife and carried Xian into the toilet. The next day, he found Lao Shen again and insisted that Officer Jing was the murderer. He first targeted the old man living alone in order to be his training partner, just like the case 30 years ago. But the real target of the murderer was a woman, and a young woman with long straight hair. Lao Shen just started to think that he was talking nonsense, but suddenly he remembered that there was a lot of noise upstairs last night. He was worried that something might happen to Xian, so he hurried back to the rental building. When they entered, the room was empty. They thought that Xian had gone to work, but the refrigerator was not there. A large pool of blood flowed out. When the old whore opened it, he was shocked when he opened it. There was actually the head of his best friend inside. His body was also dismembered and placed in the freezer of the refrigerator. The old whore thought it was unreasonable. The murderer had always been very cautious when committing crimes. There was no loophole left, but this time it turned out to be a mess. Old Shen wanted to call the police immediately, but the old prostitute stopped him. Now that Xian's body has not been found, it means that Xian has been captured by the murderer. If the police are alerted, the murderer will definitely kill him immediately. After silencing him, he found the police officer's files from that year and discovered that the recent deaths of several elderly people were exactly the same as the cases 30 years ago. They were all murdered and disguised as accidental deaths. After killing a few old people to practice, the murderer would start to target young women. The victims were all about 20-year-old girls living alone far away from home. It was very easy to start. The murderer was extremely cruel and killed 13 girls in one breath without leaving any trace. The police have not solved the case until now. The old prostitute believes that the murderer has returned and is hiding in the old prostitute in their community had met the killer when he was young. The police officer and captain were on patrol at that time, and the murderer showed up arrogantly. The captain rushed forward to arrest him. The murderer immediately used the sharp knife in his hand to prick the captain dozens of times. The police officer had just started working as a police officer. He was so frightened by the scene that he stayed in the car and had no idea what to do. When the old prostitute rushed over, the murderer immediately ran away. After the police officer retired, he had been secretly investigating and left a list of suspects. In order to find out the whereabouts of the murderer and to rescue Jian as soon as possible, the two old men acted as temporary detectives and investigated the suspects one by one. Because 30 years have passed, the murderer is now at least 60 years old. The targets of their investigation are all elderly people. Can they be included on the list? After searching for all the people, they still couldn't identify the murderer. After a hard day's work, they came to Toast Bakery for lunch. This was a man who also came to buy bread. When the old prostitute saw him, his body started to tremble involuntarily. This feeling was the same as 30 years ago. Is he the same as the murderer back then? This man is a doctor. I heard that his wife was completely paralyzed after she fell ill 10 years ago. While the doctor was holding a meeting for a whole day, the old prostitute pretended to be a patient and watched the doctor closely. Now he was even more sure that the doctor who was dying in front of him was the murderer who had taken human life so lightly. His wife suddenly started crying. It turned out that he was incontinent. The doctor quickly found an excuse and left. The scene turned to a secret room and Jian was tied to the operating table. The murderer was delivering some kind of mysterious liquid to him. Watching his skillful operation was definitely not the first time he had done this kind of thing. Cai Yin was begging hard, but the murderer left the old prostitute without saying a word. They found the doctor's address. This was the doctor who happened to come out in a hurry. He seemed to be going to buy something. The old whore asked the old ant to go in and investigate. He went to follow the doctor. The old ant was a general and quickly unlocked the doctor's door. However, after groping for a long time in the house, nothing happened. After finding any useful clues, he finally discovered that a certain room was not only equipped with a steel door but also had a combination lock. There must be something important hidden inside. The old aunt spent a long time breaking it with her hands and finally broke the door lock. Unexpectedly, the doctor happened to be there at this time. He came back, but the doctor did not embarrass him and instead told the aunt to leave immediately. The speechless aunt with her back to the doctor became more convinced that there was a ghost inside. She was about to open the steel door, but the doctor suddenly rushed up. Just as the two were pulling, the old prostitute finally rushed over and found a pistol. The old lady rushed into the room, but was shocked by the sight in front of her. There was a large field of factor flowers cultivated inside. This kind of flower is specially used to make opium. Could it be that the doctor is a big drug lord? Doctor, hurry up. Kneeling on the ground, he explained that his wife had suffered from illness all year round and that he planted these flowers to treat his muscular dystrophy. The old prostitute did not believe the doctor. He searched around in the greenhouse but could not find any trace of GN. The doctor hurriedly after putting on a mask. The old prostitute suddenly laughed after looking at it. The excited old prostitute immediately pulled the trigger on the flight. The old prostitute hurriedly hugged him because he didn't want the old prostitute to misunderstand the doctor's true identity. However, the next second he was stunned by the toy gun in the old prostitute's hand, and then he found a hang tag from the old prostitute, which said that the old prostitute was a patient with dementia. This joke was so happy that the old prostitute was quickly taken away by the hospital staff, but he kept saying that the doctor was the murderer back then. The old prostitute and the doctor quickly shook hands and checked. After returning home, the old aunt tossed and turned and couldn't catch her eyes because Gian was still missing. Not only was he found soon, he was sure to be more dangerous. He remembered that Officer Kui once said that an old man named Han was also missing. The old aunt immediately came to the old man Han's house. They checked to see if he was still alive. Unexpectedly, he was scared to death as soon as he entered because old man Han had been hanged and seemed to have been dead for several days. He walked out of the room trembling and found a dying yellow man lying on the ground. Go Huanggo was obviously attacked and his eyes went out. There was a key and an odd thing on the ground. After picking it up, the old man immediately understood everything. The murderer must be attacking old man Han. Seeing his master being attacked, the white dog bravely rushed towards the murderer and bit the killer's leg. The murderer became so angry that he picked up something nearby and hit the yellow dog, seriously injuring him. After that, the murderer violently assaulted old man Han again, strangled him and then pretended to hang himself. The old aunt was very familiar with the murderer's key because he was the one who matched it. That day, the old aunt received a call and matched a key to a customer. The man was wearing a Mickey pattern and had a big hole in his leg because he was curious. At that time, the old aunt couldn't help but look at him a few more times. He immediately found the customer's address. The customer happened to be not at home at the moment, so the old aunt used the key to successfully enter the room. There were all kinds of old man's information posted on the wall. In the drawer, there were looking at the photos of the police officer and other old men. It seemed that the murderer was the customer he helped match the key with. He immediately called the police and the police found his work badge. It turned out that the murderer's name was Pei Duzi, and he was a train driver. But why he looked so young? In order to rescue GN as soon as possible, they immediately came to the train station. The old aunt took a spotted hand and directly found Pei Duzi. The murderer knew that he had been defeated. He hated the old aunt very much and beat the old aunt hard. When the police came over, they couldn't stop him and he was quickly beaten down by the murderer. Not wanting to get too entangled, she immediately ran away. The persistent old aunt kept following him, but he was an old man after all, so he couldn't catch up with the strong murderer. Just when the murderer was about to escape, something unexpected happened. After Pei Do was killed, the other party immediately drove away from the scene. The old aunt quickly asked him about Jian's whereabouts, but Pei Duzi said that Jian was not caught by him. It turned out that Dang Guan and Pei Duzi went straight into the police officer's room and strangled him with a rope first. After hanging himself in the fake city, he happened to discover Ching Chun. The beautiful Jian, Pei Duzi, instantly became interested and secretly followed Jian. After the death of the police officer subsided, he came to Jian's room again and prepared to do something evil to him. When he picked up the ring, he found that there was another person in the room. The killer had just killed Xian's best friend. His whole body was covered in blood. Pei was dumbfounded when he saw that this guy was 10,000 more ferocious than him, so he closed the door and left. After saying this, Pei completely falsely accused him of his life. This is great. The only person who had seen the true face of the murderer was now dead. Not long after, the police investigated and found that Pei had been working at the railway for many years and had not been promoted. He was often suppressed by his old boss. He believed that the old man should give up his position and take risks instead of standing still. It affects the future and promotion of young people. Pei made a lot of comments attacking the elderly on the internet, but he still felt that it was not enough, so he started to hand over anti-drug and arrest the elderly to thank him for his points. But the real murderer who kidnapped Jian was still at large at this time, and he started to get worse. Injecting a black liquid into Jian's situation is becoming more and more dangerous. The old provincial officer told the police that Bei Duqi only killed the elderly. The one who kidnapped Jian was the murderer from 30 years ago. He hoped that the police would launch an investigation immediately, but the Korean police remained as usual. The murderous mother of 30 years ago is roughly how old she is now. I finally got over it. Those old people were killing people unintentionally. Oh, they say they are hiding people. Those people are also human. You are still looking at me, okay, sir. Stop talking and we have to do this too. Oh, what an angry old provincial. He found the proprietress of the toast shop again. She was one of the victims 30 years ago and the only survivor of the murderer. The proprietress told the old provincial that she had a strong smell on her body. The fragrance smelled great, and her hand shape was very strange. She seemed to have one extra finger than the average person. When he saw the red roses on the table, the old governor suddenly thought of something, so he immediately came to the doctor's house. She lied that she had a stomachache and asked the doctor for help. After a diagnosis, the doctor found that there was a scar on the finger. Oh, you were doing it? The pain before was correct. Did you think I could scream? Well, I thought I could scream well. Finally, the old aunt woke up and found Xian. Later, the old aunt was very excited, but Xian could not speak because her tongue had been paralyzed. The doctor brought in another woman. This woman was her wife. She arrogantly told the old aunt that she would cut off Xian immediately. The nerves made her completely paralyzed like her own wife, making her a plaything at her mercy. The old aunt asked her why she did this. The doctor said that her wife was the one she kidnapped back then. After paralyzing her, he not only completely controlled her, but also made it easier to hide. After decades of his identity, his wife had become old and lustful. She had no interest in her anymore. When she met the young and beautiful Xian, she once again ignited her youthful impulse, so she tied her back to replace her. She is her own wife, and Bei Duqi is her imitator. She replicated what the doctor had done for 30 years, and the killing techniques were basically the same. Xian's best friend happened to come home that day and was very drunk. The doctor had already hidden away. He directly wiped out her neck with a knife in the room. When Xian came back, she immediately threw her unconscious. This was Duqi, the companion with evil intentions, who also came to Xian's door. When she unlocked the door, the doctor had already heard the noise. Holding a hammer with her face full of vision, she looked extremely horrified. She was drooling when she was being fucked by Duqi. The doctor was 10,000 times worse than she was, so she quickly ran away. But the doctor was very cunning. She deliberately left evidence at the scene to try to frame the blame. Pei Daoqi took the blame for him, but he didn't expect Lao Shen to find out. Dr. Pei Daoqi had to kill her and silence her. After saying that, the doctor took out a chainsaw and was about to burn her wife to death first. Then there was the sound of the doctor's gunshot. Suddenly killed, she escaped from the hospital and took away her police son's pistol. At this time, her spirit had returned to normal, but the doctor did not panic at all. Instead, he laughed at the old prostitute for being a coward. It turned out that when the captain was killed, he was sitting the person in the car was not Officer Kui but the old prostitute. Because of his own cowardice, he watched the murderer and the captain die. This incident became a lingering dream for her. She was very reluctant to recall this experience. After years of mental torture, he contracted schizophrenia and became a crazy old man. However, he suffered a lifetime of suffering. The old whore's heart was already filled with anger and courage. He immediately triggered the flight and knocked off the doctor's ear. The old whore was ready to take the cure. The doctor who escaped secretly opened a bottle of acid and pounced on the old whore. His gun also fell to the ground. The old whore rushed up to fight with the doctor to cover the old whore and took Ji-en away in order to avenge the captain and for the pain he had endured all these years. The old whore launched a storm spell at the doctor, but the doctor touched the pistol on the ground and shot him in the stomach. The old whore fell to the ground, and his wife kept crying next to him. The doctor was extremely upset after hearing this. He shot his head off with one shot, and then he immediately caught up with Lao Shen and Ji-en in the heavy rain. Lao Shen knew that he would not be able to escape with Ji-en, so he found a place to hide. Then he picked up a brick and shot it from behind. The doctor rushed forward, but the doctor's skills were so good that he quickly put old Shen down on the ground. Just when the doctor was about to kill old Shen, the old prostitute rushed over again and kicked the doctor out. Then he angrily kicked the doctor out. The wild beast completely beat the doctor into a pig's head. He picked up the stone next to him and prepared to smash the doctor to death to avenge the team leader and Officer Kui. But Lao Shen kept stopping him and even used his own body to save the doctor's life because he didn't want the old man to kill him. It was enough for them to reach this point in the sad murder case of prostitutes. Finally, they handed the doctor to the police and let this murderer who deserved death accept the punishment of the law. The old prostitute finally completed his own redemption and gave the captain and Officer Kui an explanation. His 30-year-old knot was also completely resolved. Xian quickly recovered under the care of doctors, while old Shen Ziyi lived a happy life with the proprietress of Toast Hall.